Hey everybody, welcome back to Not Another Tooling podcast with myself, Austin Pearson, and on don't know how many miles it is now, I'm losing track. My wonderful co-host, Mr. Matt Malcolm. Matt, how are you today? You're looking quite festive there in that
You know
jumper.
what? It's not even a Christmas jumper. I feel like a bit apprehensive about putting it on because I'm not really a Christmas person. But yeah, it's almost those colours.
It's good to see some snow out there out here.
No. Actually, there's a bit of frost. There's a bit of frost. Not proper snow though.
Okay.
We missed the boat, so we literally had a dusting versus people 5 miles away with sledging and all sorts. So we missed out on that.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy up here. We've still got a lot of snow, although it's all turned to ice. So for those of you who are watching this, we've just had a big dump of snow in the UK, which is fairly unusual, and the UK can't cope with these things. So everyone's having time off. Kids are off school and trains aren't running and whatever. So anyway, let's get into it today. I'm going to talk about what is the real total cost of ownership of your tools. And I wanted to explore this a little bit because when I go and talk to people, typically I say, what does your tool cost you? And they say, well, it costs me whatever the license renewal cost is, and forget about all the other stuff. But then when I ask the question, how do you measure the value of your tool to your organization? That's often a blank face as well. So let's start with the first piece then. So when you're trying to understand, Matt, you're often going into businesses. They want you to do some assessment on what tools they've got and the value they're bringing. How do you start understanding, what sort of things should people be looking at to understand the total cost of ownership of their tool?
So I think it's clearly above and beyond just looking at the bookmark price for the most part. And I was just kind of thinking of maybe it's a real crappy one, but trying to think of an analogy that will best represent how you gather the full cost. So perhaps the scenario is like you need to buy a car, maybe, or even rent a car. You've got the price of the car, whether it's rental or the purchase price, which is ultimately akin to the licenses. But then what you don't typically account for when you're trying to find the right car is, do I need certain types of tyres with it? How much is the servicing? Is it more expensive servicing for this vendor? What's the tax on it? Is the tax this? Is the tax this? What is the insurance bracket? Is it this? Is it that? Can I drive it myself or do I need a driver? All those things are equivalent to looking at the facets of extra things you need to consider when looking at the overall cost of items. Because even though the licensing position is the very binary, unambiguous part of it, albeit depending on the software seller, it could be ambiguous. But that's always the easy thing to work out. The extra consideration is all of the feeding and watering to actually operate that tool. That's what isn't not always not considered, but isn't normally documented. Yeah, there you go. That's a better position. It's not a documented position. Known about, roughly, but not always documented.
Yeah, I totally agree, because you typically, in the first instance, you want to understand how much hardware it's going to cost to run your tool. I'm showing my age now because most stuff people are buying is SaaS these days, but actually still the majority of what people are running seems to be on-premise tools. So you've got the cost of the hardware, which then comes with the cost of a hypervisor and an operating system. And actually a lot of tools out there still require you to buy the databases separately, and you stick a SQL license on and suddenly you've got $5,000, and then you need 3 of those because you're running HADR, and the costs soon seem to spiral, and definitely need looking at, because obviously every 3 years you're going to refresh that hardware, and then you've got, well, how much does it cost me to power that and heat or cool it, and the cost of any people that are maintaining the hardware, as well as the people that are looking after the software, right? And typically, even in the smallest enterprises, right, you still need 2 people to know something about the software in case
Yeah.
one goes off, right? And that is two people that need training and need updating on a regular basis and need to have a pretty reasonable level of skill to operate the tool. And the skills to be able to upgrade it on a regular basis. What am I missing here, Matt?
I was just I'm mainly smiling. I was thinking back to you're talking about like two people to operate a tool. When I was working for services provider, gosh, must be over a decade ago now. There was two of us in the tools team, and the two of us in the tools team, we both supported SolarWinds was one, and then it was BMC Patrol, which shows major, and Portal, I think it was. There's a handful of enterprise, mostly monitoring type tools, but it was always just us. And then the upgrades, we'd come in on a weekend and we'd tag team a few hour upgrade every 2 or 3 weeks. But the point being there, even though that was a relatively small deployment, small installation across the spread of products, there were still two people. There's still two sets of skills that would be hard to replace, especially in an organization when you have a multitude of products. If it's a blended resource who has a bit of that skill, a bit of that skill, a bit of that skill, that isn't easy stuff you go to market with. It's the kind of stuff you see in job specs when people ask for 6 different skill sets, but rarely would you be able to fill them all. And there's an extra cost in itself, is the ability of having somebody to actually service that tool set.
You're absolutely spot on, as usual. Because although those skills are out there, the skills to get the best out of a tool set is definitely probably fairly few and far between, as well as knowing the company and what they need that are running this. So it's not as straightforward as swapping somebody out and getting somebody in, or even outsourcing it to a third party to run, because that third party doesn't understand your business and what services are most important to you and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff there that I think is important. Another one that I'm just going to add into the mix, because cyber is absolutely on everybody's radar at the moment, is those people having the skills and the ability to upgrade that platform, or you paying a vendor or a third party to upgrade that platform.
Yeah.
I read a report recently that the second place hackers go is outdated network management tools. So if you've not patched it,
I think we know a story.
Yeah, I think everyone knows. knows the big SolarWinds one, right? But still, it's not necessarily a big priority for people. I probably would struggle to find a company whose tools are.
Someone's at the front door doorbell.
There you go. Someone's at the front door.
Yeah. Probably the SolarWinds rep saying, "Oh,
that's quick.
We've moved on now." But it's interesting because it's quite a big cost, and doing a project with an organization at the moment where they have 10,000 servers and network devices, so it's okay. But their monitoring tooling alone requires 147 servers to run that infrastructure.
Crazy. The only thing I've
to upgrade is around about £60,000 worth of professional services to get it from where it was to. And when they looked at it, they go, it's going to be cheaper for us to move than to stay where we are and upgrade, which is crazy.
But on that upgrade front, so when we talked at the beginning around like the hosting costs, right, of what might be needed, even with, as you said, majority of the solutions are SaaS these days, even with a lot of the SaaS solutions, the upgrade path in itself, irrespective of it being SaaS, is so convoluted, pretty much most of the stacks, not all of them, but a lot of them, that in itself introduces complexity, because the problem you face there as well, which if you had it all back in olden days when we had data centers and stuff, you would have a bit of control of the frequency of the upgrade. You decide. We plan it in, we do it once a year, or whatever that release cycle is, based upon costing, resource availability, all the rest of it. The benefit of moving to a SaaS solution, great, you don't have those overheads around the hosting side of things. But then in a lot of cases, you're forced to upgrade twice a year with some solutions, maybe even more depending on releases. So now you have this extra cost. It's already complex to upgrade the solution. There's extra considerations to make around the content within the individual SaaS offering, whatever it is. But now you're forced to upgrade it 2-3 times a year. So you've got the overhead where you have no control. And if you don't abide by those rules, you fall out of support, out of compliance. So there's extra consideration there now. It's like if I was going back to the car analogy, you normally replace your oil once a year on a service, right? Normally, most people. But actually, with this particular model, if you want to keep the warranty, that oil has to be replaced 3 times a year. And by the way, it costs 200 quid a go with this particular oil. Oh, there's extra cost. Like all these things sort of, you could easily dismiss these as extra costs that contribute to the total ownership costs, but it's still extra costs. Could be one resource doing it, could be 5.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And that's maybe a good subject for another time, actually, is talking about the SaaS model, because it's not really a SaaS model, I don't think, in the tooling world as we would typically understand SaaS. But anyway,
it's more of a SaaS, isn't it? It's what it is, more of a sort of platform as a service with some solutions versus full SaaS.
Yeah. And another one that leads me to is the cost of integrations.
Oh, yes.
Which can be huge. And if you think back to the big 4 tool sets we've all worked with, they come in so many different pieces with different products that do this bit, that bit, and the other. And just keeping them integrated in a single vendor is hard enough, let alone then keeping them integrated with third-party tool sets like an ITSM provider, or X Matters or whatever it is you're using for notifications and stuff. There's a lot of work in there as well that adds to the cost.
Certainly does. And I suppose we want the freedom to be able to integrate freely. And I think there was a period of time where some vendors were quite stringent on you going outside of the boundaries of their platform. I think over time, though, most are forced into a position of being able to integrate freely, even though some scenarios might not always work out, but ultimately that is the case. But then again, that introduces more complexity. The more complex the solution, the more free the solution, the higher cost it's going to be to look after it, whether that's at the upgrade time or other. It ultimately introduces extra overhead, extra running time, extra skills needed. What I was just thinking about from a resourcing point of view is clearly, finding a good tooling type person, whether they're a monitoring person or an ITSM or an XYZ person, that in itself is a challenge with its associated costs. There's pros and cons for contingent labor. That's always going to be available for these spaces because of the niche requirements. Permanent resources, but trying to get the good skills maintained for a long term, they disappear. You're a bit stuck. I am more on board with the idea of MSP relationships these days, so I was not so keen on it back in the day, but I think realistically, that is like a nice hands-free approach. Why not? But in my head, I'm thinking actually, most tools, so if you want to try and get the value out of it, you've got, I'm making this up on the spot, but you've got like a primary and a secondary person for the tool. You've got the primary person, who is your tool support person, your developer, whoever your hands-on tool, and I'm making this thing work. I'm keeping it running, or I'm developing it, or whatever else. But you kind of need, and this is rarely would this be an individual. I'd see it more often than not to be 2 personas. Is that secondary person, is that evangelist that come and use it, that how are we going to measure this, that it's delivering success? It's like that power user come goat herder, so to speak, who brings everybody in the fold saying, we've got this tool here, it's got 12 features, we're only using 4. We think we can help you with this feature. There's 5 features. Like it's that somebody else in the business who understands the business at a good enough level from a hearts and minds perspective, an operational hearts and minds perspective, who can go, show me tech, okay, great, and then here's how we apply it. Without that kind of person, this isn't to make up a new role for the sake of it, but without that kind of person, you're stuck with someone doing what they always know and always said they do. Like there's the technical focus where it dilutes a little bit from having somebody who is business and operation focused. Like I say, sometimes it could be one person, rarely though. So that in itself introduces more technical / non-technical debt as the overall total ownership cost, because you need somebody to be that evangelist, that shower and teller of the solution. Otherwise, you're hitting yourself double the amount of time because you're not getting the potential value from the solution because nobody knows about it. The user engagement is rubbish, things like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Another one I've just thought of was sort of extending, customizing, and typically through scripts, right, in your tool set, and then you have to maintain those going forward. And then when you upgrade or change something, or Cisco releases a new version of the iOS, whatever it is, then you've got to upgrade your scripts and around that and all of that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff. But coming back to what you were saying about, that's a really nice segue into the second half of what we were going to talk about. Was, you've got we've talked about all the physical, tangible costs here, but then how do you measure the value of that tool to the business?
Sorry to interrupt. This is the first time it's happened. I'm going to have to open this door. That was the doorbell.
Nice.
Hey, mate, come through. No worries, mate. Come through. Come through. Come on.
Hi.
Hello.
In a bit, mate. Come on, see in a bit. That was the doorbell. I turned it off.
So the second piece of this is, how have you measured the value of your tool to the business? Because actually we've got the sticker price, and then we've got all these other bits and pieces that we could work out on a big spreadsheet. But if your tool saved you from having a huge outage 2 months ago that would have cost you £1 million, then suddenly there's a massive value to that tool set that you need to bring in. Or does it bring a level of automation that means that it's quicker for you to solve problems, and what's the value to that? All the stuff we normally talk about, but I typically don't see people, certainly in the past few years, understanding the value they've got from their tool and measuring that. It's definitely something that I am really hot on with customers. But I don't know, what have you seen people doing, if anything, and what should they be doing so that they can understand the cost or the value of that tool to them, and bring that into costs plus value equation?
So realistically, the velocity of seeing that more detailed cost analysis doesn't really take place at the point of acquiring the product most of the time.
Yeah.
It does come up is at the point more product needs to be purchased, new license agreements or whatever it might be. Only at that point can people have the ability to sort of look back on actually what has it done for the business, that look left kind of scenario. But even at that point, even there, rarely I would see that all of the costs are considered. And I got a good example more recently. So there's a scenario where a specific functionality of a given product is worked out, POC territory, done its job. And there's a notion there where, you know what, it's great. Let's just roll that out everywhere across the estate. And let's close down that other product and that other one, rationalization territory. Great. The figures at the moment are primarily based upon license product costs. But what isn't considered in that, and this is just to highlight that it isn't an active thing that tends to come up, but what isn't in that is anything we're discussing now. Okay, so what's it going to cost us in terms of, is there any hosting differences? Have we got more data to deal with now going through that particular pipe compared to before? Have we got people to train? How are we going to train them? What is the costs? We've now got particular skills we need for the people consuming this versus the product that we're used to. All of these loose end bits are never really in that initial business proposition, business case. It's just a figure on the product. I suppose what I'm trying to say is it's still very logical to look at the overall running costs and at a point in time, whether it was acquisition of the product or in this scenario where, looking to expand the product. But even so, that notion of considering all of those softer costs still doesn't happen. So why, I suppose, why are we in that state where it's logical to look at the wider breadth of the ownership of the costs, the infrastructure, the people, the processing, but still it doesn't become an active thing, even though in reality, in some cases, it'll quash your business case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's couple of things there. One is the cost of change. I think you called about there, right? Which is an often forgotten piece that really needs to be factored in. And secondly, I think there's this whole, if you're buying a tool for the business, whatever it is, let's say it's a new web app or something, you measure the value of that, right? We get more transactions through that, more people buy things, so our revenue goes up. In IT, there was a Gartner stat recently, I think it was somewhere between 13 and 17% of IT organizations were the only ones that understood how to relate their IT purchases to business value, which is a massive amount of it, right? At least 83% of businesses have no idea how to track the value of their stuff, and therefore they're just, in these scenarios, they just get stuck.
You know where, and I've observed that, and I can potentially see some areas of disconnect. Let's say it's a retail business. Retail business is clearly growing, from a retail perspective, they're doing well. And they have certain figures, KPIs, etc., associated to the growth of the retail business. So more sales, more profit, more locations, more XYZ, but retail territory. But then, because they started off as a retail business, maybe this is the reason, I don't know, but let's pretend. Because they started off as a retail business and not as an IT organization. If that was ever a transition to make from IT to retail, I don't know. But nonetheless, there isn't then this marry-up of supporting KPIs, metrics in the specific IT space itself. So if there isn't at that level, which would essentially meet the IT part of the business to the retail part of the business, there's never going to be any associated KPIs below. But then if you can just go in there and be a bit of a dot walker to say, what's the big business view? Show me the numbers. Okay, now this part of the business, what numbers can we actually impact? It will literally be a whiteboard mapping activity to understand we need to increase the revenue here. We need to increase the number of sales here. We need to increase the number of product lines here. Okay, how can IT support those things? In some cases, right, it's not going to happen. Impossible. Some cases it might be a secondary input. Some cases it might be, potential. But ultimately, if there's no linkage from the bigger business KPIs, and I'm assuming all businesses will have sufficient KPIs to grow, you would hope anyway. But if there's no linkage from there to what IT is doing for them, then rarely would it be considered down the rest of the stack. But that's what you do. You go in and you create that linkage at that level, then work backwards. And then what it does, just for the nature of the exercise, and when you start to scrutinize it, you can then begin to walk backwards from that IT stack and start putting numbers and everything. Well, we think the infrastructure needed to be able to deliver this kind of value back to this business. Okay, how can we translate that? Well, we need this, and we need this, and we need this. I don't know what those thises are in this context, but there should be a mechanism to almost prove the value of having, not to use the word value, prove the substance of the thing that's at the lower level. If the thing at the lower level doesn't move the needle anywhere up the stack, then do we really do it in the first place? So it highlights that exercise. But predominantly the reason why I don't see it is because that gap, that linkage between the business KPIs that would expect to exist in most businesses does have no linkage back to the rest of the business. Sometimes what you do see is like more like a lip service, a wording type, we are the IT or whatever the technology department is, and we do statement. And that's okay. Maybe that gives a bit of a hurrah at the end of the year or something, I don't know. But then the translation of that into numbers doesn't, that's the gap. So anyway, long-winded way to say, when I don't see numbers downstream in the technology space, it's because that gap hasn't been linked.
I totally agree. Totally agree. So see that everywhere. Okay. All right. So that was really good. We started out looking at the physical cost, let's call them, of running tools. You had a great analogy, Matt, about don't just look at the sticker price of the car, but look at what's it going to cost you to replace the tires, do the servicing, tax it, insure it, etc., etc. Very much the same in the tool space. You've got the license cost, but then you've got what's your servo OS, hypervisor database, heating, cooling, a lot around people we talked about. So, how many people do you need to do this, but not just to do this, to be a technology owner and evangelist, to keep your scripts updated and any customizations, integrations, etc. Those are all things that you can kind of put on a spreadsheet, but there's a lot of them to consider. And then the second half was, well, how do we show what the value is of the tool today, which is a question that we typically only comes up at replacement or renewal time, and still most of the time you're only looking at the product cost, not the value. And then we went off on a slight tangent around including the cost of change when you look at these potentially replacing your tool. And then as always, we brought it back to the business value and trying to link the bigger business KPIs to what IT is providing, which you can work downstream into the tools and try and come up with a mechanism to be able to measure the value that IT and right down to your tools in our case are providing to measure that business value, so that you really understand what that is before you make any decisions on tools. So wonderful. Thank you very much, Matt. That was good as always. I'm sure we could have done another hour on that subject.
I'm sure it'll unfold.
As always. But thank you very much for watching, everybody. And we look forward to talking to you on the next episode. Take care.
See you later.